This is Garis Masculist MGTOW flyers, that is 2-3 page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 615, entitled The Masculisting of Google. Description. 5 years ago, James Damore was fired from Google for writing a manifesto suggesting that the underrepresentation of women as software engineers in Google may be due to their lower average intelligence. This makes Google a suitable target for the masculisting, biconsciousing of the company. This flyer suggests a plan on how this might be done, that is, starting with one male employee who reads masculist ideas, becomes angry and hateful at the horrible, decades-lasting gender crimes that women commit against men, then spreads masculist links and ideas to other men in the company who do the same. When there are hundreds of masculists in the company, the time is then ripe to go public with this fact, smashing misandrist comments publicly coming from monoconscious feminists at Google. These women and management will then become conscious that they can't fire hundreds of masculists at Google. So Google will then have become masculisted, that is, biconscious, so that if the monoconscious feminists don't learn some masculism and become biconscious, they will have their fucking heads bitten off. The flyer itself. The Masculisting of Google by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. This flyer is a plan for the Masculisting of Google, the search and AI company. That is, a plan for the biconsciousing of Google. Why Google? Because 5 years ago, 2018, one of Google's male employees, James Damore, D-A-M-O-R-E, wrote a manifesto that posed the question whether the reason why women were underrepresented in the programmer software engineer category might be because women may be a bit dumber than men on average. He was fired from his position at Google, whom he later sued, saying the company discriminated against conservative white men. For me, this makes Google a good target for masculisting, for making it biconscious. Now, 5 years is a long time in the manosphere, so it's possible that the company has been influenced a lot by masculist and MGTOW ideas in the meantime. If not, or not enough, then this flyer spells out a plan on how Google can be masculisted, arguing that if a particularly misandrist, gynocentric company like Google can be masculisted, then millions of other companies can be too, using similar tactics to those presented in this flyer. You could say that what goes around comes around, that vengeance is sweet, that it is time that the predominance of monoconscious feminism be taken down a peg or two, or 10, at Google. So, how to masculist Google? Obviously, the first step is education, that is, teaching male members of Google masculist ideas so that men are in possession of their own gender political ideology, that is, masculism, that they can use not only to counter the monoconscious feminist rhetoric in their company, but to crush it with a hugely more powerful masculist rhetoric. So how to educate Google's male members so that there are enough of them for a masculist rebellion to occur in the company, so that the gender political pendulum is swung back from its excessively overreached feminist position to a position that recognizes that gender oppression is very much a two-way street. So, I hope that this flyer is read/viewed by a male member of Google who takes it to heart, who then becomes the seed that sows the mighty oak of masculism inside the heart of Google. Recently, I updated a PowerPoint that presents the core ideas of masculism that you can read/watch on my website by clicking on the Masculist MGTOW tab. It's flyer number 0B2. You can either read it in its PowerPoint format or watch me reading it aloud in 6 video parts. This PowerPoint is hard-hitting, spelling out why masculists have such a hatred of gender criminal women who commit such horrible and decades-lasting gender crimes against men, such as women's manslavery, women's divorce rape, women's forced fathering. I hope that this first male Google employee seeder will then be sufficiently interested, curious and motivated to learn more and have his masculist consciousness raised and bother to study this OB2 flyer that is entitled Masculism 101. Hopefully, once he has become a masculist, so a biconscious masculist, since he's probably very conscious of how men oppress women, since he is working in a heavily feministed working environment, surrounded by highly intelligent women who are strictly monoconscious feminists by definition, since they know nothing about masculism, so know nothing of how women oppress men, and in fact worse. Since many of women's gender crimes against men are so horrible and last decades that they make even rape, which is one of the worst ways that men oppress women, seem like small beer in comparison to the worst 3 gender crimes that women commit against men, as mentioned above. I hope that this male Google masculist seeder will become aware how powerful masculist ideas are, especially the one that says, thanks to men giving women science-based medicine, so that women now have a life expectancy of 85 years, hence a career window of half a century, in brackets, even for those women who stay at home looking after small children for some years, close brackets. So masculists put tremendous moral pressure on women to FIP up, that is, become FIPs, that's financially independent persons, by bothering to get career competent educations so that they become FIPs as adults and not expect fluffy style, in brackets, fluffy equals traditional woman who expects to live off the money and labour of a man for decades of his life, to leech off a man's money for decades. To masculists, fluffies are seen as manslaving, divorce-raping vermin to be severely punished by being effectively exterminated, by being totally ignored by, in brackets, masculisted men, not even pumped and dumped. Masculists are abolitionists who see fluffydom as manslavery and manslavery as slavery, and hence something to be hated and a war issue. Masculists are at war against fluffies and fluffy feminists. We kill them slowly by forcing them to rot on the shelf, manless, loveless, sexless, babyless, and utterly rejected, both socially and sexually. Masculists see manslavery as 1,000 times bigger problem than was Negro slavery in the southern states of the US in the early 1800s, given the numbers. There were several million Negro slaves in the US at the time, and there are several billion man slaves in the world today. Masculists point the finger at women, telling them, quote, "Now that women can work, they must work, since anything else is man's slavery, and man's slavery will get fluffies killed by masculists, killed slowly, forced into a slow, miserable death, rotting on the shelf, and utterly spat at." End quote. So let's hope this male Google masculist seeder becomes convinced of the power of the above masculist arguments, becomes enraged at the massive gender injustices that women commit against men, and that women oppress men far worse than vice versa. Women, fluffy women, divorce rape men, stripping a man of his kids with a 90% probability in many Western countries. So it's not surprising that in these countries, 2/3 and growing of young men say, quote, "Fuck marriage, fuck paternity. I'm not going to face a 1 chance in 4 of being divorce raped in a hated, fluffy, feminist-dominated divorce court system, having my kids ripped away from me, forced to hand over my house to my ex-wife so she can raise her kids in it, forced to pay her half my wealth and half my stuff, made to make child payments to my kids whom I'll barely be allowed to see, and if my ex-wife is a real fluffy parasite, be forced to pay her alimony until I die, with no moral nor legal obligation on her to FIP up so that she remains a parasite off me after the divorce the way she was before the divorce. Fuck that. I'm going to live the MGTOW lifestyle, by rejecting marriage, rejecting paternity, and spending my money on myself. I have a hatred of fluffies and want to see them rot on the shelf, the manslaving, divorce-raping cunts." End quote. Women who commit the horrible gender crime of forced fathering by forcing men to pay for decades for a kid he doesn't want. Women also commit the horrible gender crime of forced fathering by forcing men to pay for decades for a kid he doesn't want. Women pill lie and paternity fraud. Pill lying is when a woman wants to have a kid, but her man doesn't. So she lies to him that she's taking the pill, but isn't, gets pregnant, then by law forces him to pay for the kid that he never wanted in the first place, which is a horrible gender crime that millions of women commit routinely against men. An even worse gender crime that women commit against men is paternity fraud, where the woman lies to her man that the kid growing in her is his when she knows it's not. So he is forced to pay for a kid in capital letters that is not even his. These two examples are given the generic label of forced fathering, which are horrible gender crimes that women commit against men. About 10% of pregnancies involve paternity fraud. The fact that women have the maternity rejection right, aka abortion right, but men don't have the paternity rejection right, is the most blatant form of sexual discrimination that exists, that screams out for reform. Masculists want the para legislated so that men have the same right to reject an unwanted pregnancy that women have. Masculists also want the legislation of the OPTAB, O-P-T-A-B, obligatory paternity testing at birth, for all births, to block paternity fraud. If a man can prove his woman committed paternity fraud against him, he needs to be able to jail her for 15 years, since paternity fraud is a far worse crime than rape, since he would have been manslaved by her for 2 decades paying for a kid that is not even his. Masculists want the establishment of GECs, gender equality committees, in the parliaments that consist half of female feminists and half of male masculists, so that the gender issues of both sexes are dealt with equally. The masculist politicians in these GECs would then push for the fipping of women, the creation of a FIP society, so that men are not manslaved and divorce raped, 1 in 4 fathers, by fluffy, manslaving, divorce-raping vermin whom masculists aim to wipe off the face of the earth. Now, let's assume the male Google masculist seeder becomes full of hatred at what women are doing to men and becomes strongly motivated to change things, starting in his company. So what can he do? He can tell his male friends and male colleagues at work about masculist ideas, giving them the link to my masculist PowerPoint and asking them to read it and convert themselves to masculism and ask them to do the same, so that over a few weeks there are hundreds of freshly converted masculists in the company who see men's oppression of women as small beer in comparison and hence see monoconscious feminists as hypocrites who want equal rights with men in the parliaments but reject equal obligations with men to share equally the burden of earning the living by behaving as hypocritical fluffy feminists in the divorce courts. Once there are enough masculists inside the company, the time then becomes ripe for these masculists to go public, smashing down misandrist comments from their female monoconscious feminist colleagues, telling these women that in reality that women oppress men worse. Then the hundreds of new masculists in the company can then express their strong support for masculism by saying, "Hear, hear! We masculists in this company are fed up with your monoconscious feminist bigotry. You women will become biconscious. That is, you will learn that gender oppression is a two-way street, or we masculists will shit all over you. We are fed to the teeth with your misandrist monoconsciousness. 5 years ago, you fired James Damore, but you can't fire hundreds of us. You will become biconscious by learning masculist ideas, or we will bite your fucking heads off. We biconscious masculists have no tolerance of your hated monoconscious hypocrisy and bigotry. Learn some masculism, you hated MFBs. That's monoconscious feminazi bigots. End quote. When these female feminist employees and management see that there are hundreds of masculists in their company, then they will understand that men have spoken and that these men will have to be listened to. Otherwise, a lot of monoconscious feminazis' heads will be bitten off. These women will then realize that when men become collectively angry at women, God help women. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Author of the book Masculism, Men's Rebellion Against Being Man's Slaves to Women, an e-textbook of 610 plus masculist flyers for men's studies courses, freely downloadable in Microsoft Word format from my website. Ciao.